impressed by intensity, not volume. Famous words from Greg Glassman, founder of CrossFit, obviously. With this, he implied that the intensity at which you can train or how hard you can push during training is more important to increase overall fitness than the amount of sessions you can do or how long your sessions are. In this video, I will discuss an absolute gem of a paper that exactly discusses this topic and just came out of Scandinavia. It is an overview study that covers more than 50 years of data out of 6,000 participants, so really well done, this study. And it investigates the effects of training intensity on key variables of fitness and more specifically endurance capacity or conditioning. So can the intensity at which you're training, going from low intensity endurance training to high intensity interval training to sprint interval training, determine the amount of mitochondria the muscles build or how many capillaries are being made to transport oxygen towards the working muscles? Or can training intensity affect VO2 max? I had a close look at the data of this study, and I have to say some of the findings here really surprised me and kind of changed the way how I think about training. I will translate some of the findings more towards functional fitness. So if you are a CrossFit athlete or coach, or you are involved in HYROX or other derivatives and you're kind of struggling on how to structure your training for optimal efficiency, for optimal training efficiency, I think this video will be super interesting for you. All right, without further ado, let's dive into it. Hi everyone, I'm Gomar. I'm a senior scientist at ETH Zurich, based in Switzerland. And for the last decade or so, I studied and taught different aspects of exercise physiology, and now I want to bring some of that science back to you guys. So let's start with a little story. You have, for example, a friend and he's completely a couch potato. He is sedentary and usually doesn't engage in any physical activity or sports. But he wants to take on a challenge and he wants to run a marathon the next day without any training. So because he is sedentary, he will have a certain amount of oxygen that he can maximally take up, right? Like every human being has this. And when you're sedentary, it will be approximately 2.5 to 3.5 liters that his body can take up oxygen and deliver towards the working muscle, mostly during exercise. So he starts off his marathon, feels fine, 11, 12 kilometers an hour, and then he settles into a certain speed, and that speed requires a certain amount of oxygen. And that amount of oxygen is always a percentage of the maximal amount of oxygen that that person can take up. Usually for, as I said, untrained people like the couch potato friend, it will be 70%, 65% of his VO2 max that he can sustain whatever half an hour, 1 hour. He probably won't be able to run the full marathon. But then that's kind of the essence of exercise training or trying to improve your cardiovascular fitness. You can obviously improve this. You can improve both the total amount of oxygen that you can take up, right? Like your VO2 max, but also the threshold that you can sustain during long periods of exercise, for example, during marathon. So you will, for example, be able to run at, instead of 65% of your VO2 max, at 80% of your VO2 max. So what exactly is VO2 max and why it is important for the context of this video? It can be determined by, let's say, two different parameters or aspects. It's called the Fick equation. Very important equation here is one, how much oxygen the heart and the red blood cells, the blood, can deliver towards your quadriceps, towards your glutes when you are running. So the delivery of oxygen, but also importantly, how much you can extract, how much you can use of that oxygen. It could be that you are an extreme endurance athlete. You can push a lot of oxygen towards the working muscles, but actually you cannot really use it. And that usage is mainly determined by the mitochondria, which are the powerhouses within the muscle cell. They use oxygen to produce ATP and energy, but also how much or how many microvessels or capillaries you have surrounding the muscle fibers to deliver that oxygen that is available there. And if you are a sedentary person and you want to improve your running capacity or your overall fitness, you can train, let's say, via basically 3 different ways. That's how we usually are defining different training concepts. You can do long, easy runs. It's basically zone 2 or even a little bit above zone 3 for 30, 40, 50 minutes or beyond, right? That's one. We call this low or moderate intensity continuous endurance training, right? That's one way to improve. Then a second one would be more CrossFit style. We call this high intensity interval training. It has been around for 20, 25 years now, at least in literature. And what is that? You have a higher intensity, which would be at this threshold that we just explained, right? This threshold where you could just sustain for a long period of time, or even a little bit above or just below. And then you do that for 4 to 5 minutes, and then you have a rest period as defined by the green bars here. So for example, 4 by 4 minutes. And then you also have some interesting one, and that's something that most people don't really do, but is gaining more traction now also in science, but also in training physiology. It's called sprint interval training, where you would do, for example, 20 to 60 seconds of all-out sprint, so well above your VO2 max. You just go balls out, but then you rest 4 to 5 minutes even, right? And then you repeat this for a couple of times. And the question now, and also related to obviously the topic of this video, which one is best? Which one do we need to improve all these different aspects of fitness, mostly related to VO2 max and endurance? And we are here, at least in the beginning of the video, are mostly gonna focus on the mitochondria within the muscle and also the capillaries. And later we will talk about VO2 max and how different training intensities affect VO2 max. So really recently, a couple of weeks ago, a very beautiful paper came out in Sports Medicine. And obviously, I will also link the paper in the description. It's open access, so you can just read it yourself. It's really a gem. So if you're interested in this and want to learn more after this video, I highly suggest doing this. And it's a systematic review or an overview study that covered 50 years of data of 6,000 participants. So that's really a lot of people. And they wanted to pose the fundamental question, which training intensity is the best to improve all different aspects of fitness? So how did they do it? They defined these 3 different exercise protocols, right? Lower intensity continuous training, high intensity interval training, and sprints. I put always the right color, so blue is endurance training, green is high intensity, and sprints are yellow. And they wanted to first know on all these studies and all these participants, which kind of training improved the mitochondrial density, so how many mitochondria there are in your muscle the most, right? And they have different parameters, not super important here. You can really look at the amount of mitochondria. You can measure them with an electron microscope, so actually see how many there are within the muscle. That's one way. Or you can also measure different enzymes that are sitting inside the mitochondria, and that's kind of a derivative of how many mitochondria you have inside the muscle. And you can see here that blue as well as green and also orange evenly increased the amount of mitochondria in the muscle, right? So this is after a certain time period or a certain amount of training, usually at least 4 weeks up to 20 or 30 weeks. So that's quite interesting, right? Like, it doesn't really matter at this point, at least at this point in the paper, how you train. You will always increase the amount of mitochondria, so the usage of oxygen to efficiently make ATP. This will improve as an adaptation. There's no superior way to do this. High intensity is not better than low intensity, and so on. But obviously, there is some nuance to this, because if you see here, this is really beautiful. It is the amount of, let's say, mitochondrial density improvement. So mito pooled on the left side means just all the different parameters that are referring to the amount of mitochondria or the mitochondrial density, plotted against the intervention week, so how many weeks they were training. And here you see some nice results. Again, you see all of those improve initially the most and then kind of flatten out. But which one flattens out the most? That is clearly the sprint interval training. So the super high intensity is very good in the beginning, the first 4 or 5 weeks, but then kind of flattens out, while high-intensity interval training, more CrossFit style training, for example, or endurance training is always steadily improving through time, so for longer intervention weeks. Unfortunately, there's one caveat. Most of these high-intensity interval training studies or sprint interval training studies are quite short in time, right? Like only maximum 12 to 13 weeks. It would be cool to see if you would do such a training style for 6 months or even 1 year, what would happen then on the longer term? Because that's, I think, a key question that is kind of missing in literature now. But what would be the number one factor that determines on how many mitochondria you can develop or build in the muscle? Like, it's clearly not really the intensity at which you train. Are there other factors or determinants? And then it gets quite ironic, but also maybe straightforward. And that is simply the fitness level at which you start. You see, the white bar are the untrained people. They gain the most in mitochondrial volume or mitochondrial density. And then you have the moderately trained and the well-trained. This is the law of diminished returns. I think if you have been training yourself and you look around, in the beginning it all goes really well, but then you kind of plateau, and it doesn't really matter at which training intensity you do this, there will always be a plateau, and that's very clearly shown here. And that's why also the beginners, no matter what you give them, the beginning clients in your CrossFit affiliate, or just someone who just start doing any start to run or running program, they will improve, but then it kind of flattens out. And the key is, how do we get through that plateau? And then I wanted to talk quickly about a service we provide with wod-science. We are now developing several training programs that you can follow, that follow, let's say, the CrossFit season, and where we try to use all of these principles of these papers to build up your capacity, not only pure CrossFit, but also your aerobic capacity and also your VO2 max. So if you are interested in looking at those training programs, just click the first link in the description. You can have a 7-day free trial. Just check it out, how it works. And I think you will actually gain a lot of fitness out of this more structured training, not fully random, structured. Good. So still, like, it's not the end of the story, obviously, because maybe one type of training is more efficient, because we all know that if you do long, slow endurance training, you need a lot of volume, you need a lot of training. And referring back to what Greg Glassman said, if you want to have the most bang for your buck, it's better, what he said, to train very intense. And is this actually true? And then we can very clearly see that this is actually true. Here, they plotted the increase in mitochondrial density, so how many mitochondria they're actually improving through training, against the hours you train. Obviously, the endurance training will take much longer compared to a sprint interval training where you do a very short burst of exercise. And then per training hour, the high intensity and the sprint interval training clearly works across all fitness level, untrained, moderately trained, but also in well-trained. Indeed, Glassman, I think, was right that intensity has the most bang for your buck. But obviously, mitochondria is not everything. I mean, who kind of cares about their how many mitochondria you have in your muscle? We want to know other parameters as well, right? Like what happens inside the muscle next to the mitochondria, and also importantly, what happens to VO2 max and overall fitness. And one of these other parameters, as I already referred to, is we call this capillary density. It's very simple. It's a difficult word for how many capillaries there are actually around one muscle fiber. Here you see a muscle fiber, which is in red, which is a kind of a round shape form. And then in green are depicted the capillaries. And in an untrained person, right, like the couch potato from the beginning of the video, he will have 1, 2, maybe 3 capillaries surrounding each muscle fiber. But then when you have a very well-trained endurance athlete, marathon runner, HYROX athlete, and so on, they will have much more capillaries because they need to deliver much more oxygen towards the working muscle. And also usually they have more type 1 or slow twitch muscle fibers. And here I think it gets interesting. It kind of diverges from the mitochondria. Here you see a clear winner for more lower intensity, more volume training. So the increase in capillary density is more increasing with lower intensities such as endurance training and also high intensity interval training. It actually didn't really increase in the sprint interval training. One caveat, this also is because the muscle fibers grow more, so there's more hypertrophy with higher intensity training. That's also why you see, for example, sprinters having quite high muscle mass. They also do strength training and so on, but there is an hypertrophic effect. And obviously this will kind of diminish the effect on capillary density, but still the effects are there in my opinion. So we kind of know now that the delivery of oxygen towards the working muscles, at least via the capillary, is better with lower, higher volume training, at least according to this large pool of data. But what happens with the key variable of the key variable, which is VO2 max? Is this also affected by training intensity, or again, doesn't it really matter how you train? You just will improve your VO2 max. And then again, it has almost the same picture as the capillary density. The lower intensities, so the endurance training as well as the high intensity interval training where you're working at your threshold pace, ventilatory threshold 2 pace, are clearly better in long-term improving your VO2 max. The orange one, which is the sprint interval training, as you saw in previous slides, is kind of flatlining, increasing in a little bit, but then kind of flatlining throughout the intervention weeks, while with the lower intensities, you see this nice initial fast increase, and then it keeps creeping up throughout all the intervention weeks. And this kind of makes sense, right? Like if you are able to push the body to deliver more oxygen, we even didn't talk about the heart, but just more capillary density towards the working muscle, also the amount of oxygen they can take up will increase, and therefore VO2 max overall will increase. And that's beautifully what this data show, and I think also very important related to training intensity. So referring back to, let's say, the title of this video or the whole concept of this video, whether or not zone 2 training is that or not really useful, I don't think it is that. I think it's actually very useful to build up the training volume, especially for, let's say, endurance type athletes, HYROX athletes, or longer events like marathons and cycling and so on. Because here again, it seems that the more volume you can do, or the more training sessions you can handle, your body can handle throughout the week, the better the increase is in VO2 max. And this is, in my opinion, as a coach, but also having seen all the data, impossible if you would do everyday sprint interval training, full out, all out, until you cannot breathe anymore at the end of the workout. I don't think that's very sustainable. So that's why you see Tadej Pogačar or other big cyclists or marathon runners spending literally 80% of their training in zone 2. This is the exact reason, because they want to be able to deliver as much oxygen as possible via increased heart capacity, cardiac output, but also this vessel density, improving that as much as possible. So referring back to our CrossFit athlete or whatever, even a HYROX athlete or someone who's doing more functional fitness, right? Intensity per training hour is going to be the most efficient to a certain point. That's clear for mitochondria, but even for other parameters like VO2 max and capillary density. That is true. But still, if you want to keep improving throughout time, more than 10 weeks, half a year, 1 year, 2 years, you want to build in that training volume. And you're going to tell me who is able to do the most amount of volume. The beast mode CrossFitter who's doing a combination of high-intensity interval training, 4x4 or 12-minute AMRAP or EMOMs of 16 minutes and so on, combined with sprint interval training where he goes 90 seconds all out, then 5-minute rest, 60 seconds all out, 4-minute rest, and so on. I think over a longer period of time, he or she will get drained and not be able to increase the volume even more. While if you want to take it very seriously, you can also take the more slow and steady approach and incorporating some slow endurance training, maybe zone 2, maybe zone 3 training into your schedule, combined with obviously still sprint interval training and high intensity interval training, because that's clearly what you need. That's where you will improve the most with CrossFit, but you want to be able to do that volume. And that's also why we started the Zone 2 project not so long ago, I think now 3 weeks ago, where we have approximately 200 people who are doing, or more the beast mode CrossFit style, where they do strength and metcons, high intensity interval training metcons in 1 sessions 5 times a week, right? That's let's say your commercial CrossFitters that usually always train like that. And then you also have maybe another interesting group, and we want to see who improves the most, obviously, is a Zone 2 group who does 2 times per week this pure commercial CrossFit style strength and metcons, but then also incorporates a lot 3 sessions per week of Zone 2 training instead of their metcons. And we want to see if this added volume, right, like being able to train more minutes or more time, even at lower intensity, gives them the capacity to deliver more oxygen towards the working muscle and actually giving them a better base to improve. I don't know the answer. I'm actually very curious to see if this could actually improve. Based on this data and based on this large pool of participant data, I think it could actually work out like this, because most of those athletes were also quite well trained and they had some experience in CrossFit. So if you are kind of still struggling with this and you're not 100% sure if you are training well or structuring your whatever HYROX plan or CrossFit style plan well, I also do 101 consulting or advising, where we in detail go through your training plan and I can give you tips for improving this, like substituting 1 session there and even maybe incorporating some other testing so you can know which training you have to do. You can just book a one-on-one consulting via our website, wod-science.com. I will put it into the description. And even you can book a 15-minute free introductory call where we can just touch base on what your needs are and how you want to proceed. That is next to, as I already alluded to, our training plans. I highly encourage you to check them out, to just have some good structured training plans where you don't have to think too much, just do the training and you will improve on all aspects of fitness. All right, so this brings us to the take-home message of this paper, showing that the initial fitness level, right, like how well you are trained when starting the training program, is the most important factor in determining the increase in mitochondrial density and overall aerobic fitness. Endurance training, so lower intensity, high intensity interval training or sprint interval training are basically all contribute equally to increasing your mitochondrial density in the muscles. But this is not exactly so for, let's say, the capillaries or the delivery of oxygen. That is rather related to bit maybe higher volume and lower intensities. And this brings me to the kind of hypothetical idea related to more functional fitness, is that if you would train all the time at maximal intensity, RPE 9, right, sprint interval training well above your ventilatory threshold 2, this could lead to a training plateau because your capillary density and your VO2 max won't keep increasing. Like, you can get better at the movements and doing the movements faster, but you cannot deliver sufficient amount of oxygen to work the working muscles. And this will inevitably lead to a training plateau. So I think a good idea is to also incorporate longer training sessions at lower intensity. It doesn't have to be zone 2, potentially zone 2. I will get back to that in a couple of weeks when we have the results of our paper, but at least also incorporate 1, 2, maybe even 3 sessions, depending how much you train in lower intensities. I think on the longer term, this will give you a better aerobic base to even push harder during high intensity functional fitness. Good, that was it from my part today. Thank you for listening. If you want to learn more on why CrossFit athletes, at least to me, seem to have a low VO2 max and what the reasons for that are, just have a look at the video popping up right now. Ciao.